In this lecture, we are going to be looking at Congress. Congress is the most important representative institution in American government. In theory, the members' primary responsibility is to their constituency, meaning the people in their district or the state who they represent. Congress is among the world's most powerful legislative bodies. They write and shape legislation and exercise substantial power over the nation's budget. As we've already discussed, we have a bicameral legislature broken up into two different chambers. We have the House of Representatives, which has 435 total seats, with elections every 2 years. How many seats a state has depends on the state's population. And then, within the state, districts are portioned according to population. The minimum age to run for the House of Representatives is 25 years, and you must be a U.S. resident for at least 7 years. Now, the House is the more centralized of the two bodies. House rules give leaders more control over the legislative process and allows House members to specialize in certain legislative areas. The members are more attuned to the immediate legislative needs of local interest groups. And then we have the Senate, which has 100 total seats, 2 per state. Now, senators are elected in statewide votes every 6 years. The minimum age is 30, and you must be a U.S. resident for at least 9 years. Traditionally, this is the more deliberate of the two bodies, meaning they debate more on this. The Senate rules give its leadership less power and discourage specialization. Senators serve larger and more diverse constituencies. Also, we have what we call as a delegate. A delegate is a representative who votes according to the preference of their community. This requires the representatives to stay in constant touch with constituents and their wishes. And then we have what we call a trustee. Now, this is a representative who votes based on what they think is best for their voters. This makes the decisions based on their own judgment. Now, studies do show that most members of Congress do try to anticipate the wishes of their voters and do what they think they would want them to do. We also have what's called descriptive representation. This is a type of representation in which representatives have the same racial, gender, ethnic, religious, or educational backgrounds as their constituents. The idea is that the two individuals are so similar in background that anything said by one would very likely reflect the views of the other as well. And we talked about this a little bit last time when we talked about voting. We also have substantive representation. This is a type of representation in which representatives are held accountable to their constituency if they fail to represent that constituency properly. What this means is that in some way they are formally accountable to those they are supposed to represent. An example of this could be in Congress. How are they held accountable? Well, if their voters don't like what they are doing, then they could be defeated in the polls. They could be voted out of office. Also, what's interesting, when we look at the social composition of Congress, to see the diversity of Congress, please look at the figure 10.1 in the Who Are Americans on page 309. There's some very interesting statistics here, and especially in the Who Are Americans, it gives some great graphics to look at the representation in Congress as opposed to the population of the United States. Now, why Congress has become more diverse, it is still not an adequate representation of the U.S. population. And you can see that by looking especially at the charts on the Who Are Americans. The legal profession is the most common career of members prior to elections. And that kind of makes sense, right? We're dealing with people who are making the laws. A lot of times we like people who are trained in the law. Overall, Congress is highly educated. 9 in 10 have college degrees, and more than a third have a law degree. And if you think about that, in the total U.S. population, 0.4% of the total U.S. population has a law degree. But in Congress, a third of the members have law degrees. Now, again, evidence does indicate they do work hard to speak for their constituents and to serve their interests. All right, so congressional elections. Elections have an enormous impact on Congress, and 3 factors are especially important. 1, who decides to run for office. 2, what we call the incumbency advantage, and 3, the way in which congressional district lines are drawn. So who runs for Congress? We've discussed this a little bit before. What parties try to do is they try to ensure to find candidates who are well qualified. This includes looking at a candidate's individual political ambitions and the ability to raise enough money to mount a credible campaign. Now, incumbency is very important. What's it mean if somebody is an incumbent? It means they're running for the political office, which they currently have. So they're running for re-election. Roughly 90% of the House and Senate incumbents seeking re-election are successful. However, though, over the course of a decade, it is likely that nearly half the members of Congress will be replaced. Incumbents have a chance to promote legislature favored by important groups and interests in their district. So basically they can show, hey, I will work for what I said. I said I would do this, you elected me for it, and now look, this is what I've done while I've been in office. Also, they've already run a successful campaign, and they usually have a superior access to campaign funds. And then we look at apportionment and redistricting. The drawing of congressional districts, now this only affects the House. Why? Because remember, the senators represent the entire state. So this only really affects the House. Now, redistricting, the drawing of congressional districts, happens every 10 years, and it's required by the Constitution to reflect population changes, right? If the House is supposed to represent the population, it's good that we are looking at the population and how it has changed. And this is done in accordance with the U.S. Census. Again, the number of 435 seats has been set since 1929. So we have what's called apportionment, and this is the redistribution of seats among states. And this is what we call a zero-sum policy. There are 435 seats and only 435 seats. So for one state to gain a seat, another one has to lose a seat. In most states, redistricting is controlled by the state legislature and is a highly political process, and what they often try to do is to create an advantage for the party with a majority in the legislature. What we see is sometimes they cluster voters with similar ideological or sociological characteristics into a single district, so why that party may win that district, they're not going to win others. Or they may try to redraw the lines and separate them. So instead of having a majority in one district, now it would be a minority in two different districts, meaning they would lose that district. And that's what we call gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the manipulation of electoral districts to serve the interests of a particular group. Since the passing of the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, race has become a major and controversial consideration in drawing voting districts. Here we can have, the same examples, that maybe we have an area with a high African American population, and so they often elect an African American representative. Well, if we redraw districts and then we cut that area in half, so now the African American vote becomes a minority vote in two different districts, then we're not going to see, right? We might not see an African American representative. So those are things that are looked at when we look at things such as apportionment and gerrymandering. In the Supreme Court case of Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, the Supreme Court held a portion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that had required states and localities with a history of racially biased election laws to obtain federal preclearance before adopting new voting laws. They said this was unconstitutional. And we talked about this in a previous lecture, where they had to have this pre-clearance. Why? Because these were areas that traditionally had a history of racial bias. And they declared in 2013, the Supreme Court declared this part was unconstitutional, meaning they no longer had to have pre-clearance. Critics charge that the elimination of pre-clearance has encouraged racial gerrymandering and other restrictions on minority voting. All right, congressional organization. Again, we've talked a little bit about this when we talked about parties. In congressional organization, we have our party leadership. Much of the actual work of Congress is controlled by the parties, such as writing rules of procedure, selecting leaders who direct the flow of congressional business. Every 2 years, at the beginning of a new Congress, New House leaders are elected, and the elected leader of the majority party is the Speaker of the House, and we also elect a majority leader. The minority selects a minority leader. And then each party also elects what's called a whip. A whip is a party member who is responsible for coordinating the party's legislative strategy, building support for key issues, and counting votes. And then we have the committee system. Congress makes use of committees and subcommittees to sort through alternatives, secure information, and write legislation. So we're going to look at 4 different types of committee. First, we have what's called the standing committees. Now, these remain in existence from one session of Congress to the next. This is the committees that have the power to propose and write legislation. The jurisdiction of each committee covers one particular subject matter. All standing committees receive numerous legislative proposals, and the House Rules Committee decides the order in which bills come up for a vote on the House floor and determines the specific rules that govern the length of debate and opportunity for amendments. Most standing committees are then broken into subcommittees that specialize in particular aspects of the committee's work. Much of the hard work of deliberating, holding hearings, going through markup, which is the process of amending and rewriting a bill, this often all takes place within these subcommittees. Also, an important feature of these committees, standing committees, is they have the power to conduct hearings and launch investigation. Legislative hearings, these are conducted to address specific bills. And then we have what's called oversight hearings, and these are more investigative in nature. All right, then that's going to lead us to select committees. Usually these are not permanent, and they usually do not have the power to present legislation to the full Congress. They do hold hearings and serve as focal points of issues they are charged with considering. So an example from the textbook was after the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol by Trump supporters, the House created a select committee to investigate if the mob had been organized by Trump and his associates. Then we have what's called a joint committee. Now, this is committees that involve members from both the Senate and the House. These committees look at 4 topics, including economic, taxation, library, and printing. They are permanent, but they do not have the power to present legislation. And then we have what's called conference committees, and these are temporary. The members are appointed by the Speaker of the House or the presiding officer of the Senate. They are charged with reaching a compromise on legislature once it has been passed by the House and the Senate. With each committee, leadership used to be based on seniority determined by the years of continuous service on the particular committee. However, since the 104th Congress, which was from 1995 to 1997, this has largely no longer been the case. Instead of choosing committee chairs on the basis, what they're doing now is they're choosing the committee chairs based on the loyalty to the party's leadership and priorities or the members' fundraising ability. Recently, the sharp partisan divisions have made it difficult for committees to deliberate and bring bipartisan expertise to bear on policy making as it was in the past. As we've talked about, right, with this political polarization, we're seeing this strict divide on party lines. All right, and then we also have what's called the staff system. Every member of Congress employs many staff members. In fact, they employ roughly 11,500 staffers. It's about each for each chamber. Their tasks include handling constituents' requests, dealing with legislative details, drafting proposals, organizing hearings, dealing with administrative agencies, and negotiating with lobbyists. Now, Congress itself employs more than 2,000 committee staffers. These are permanent staff that stay attached to every House and Senate committee, and they're responsible for organizing and administrating the committee's work. And then we also have staff agencies. These are legislative support agencies who are responsible for policy analysis established by Congress. They're designed to provide the legislative branch with resources and expertise independent of the executive branch. So you can see with this, right, there's a lot of things that get done in Congress, and the congressional members need help. They need help from the staff. All All right, next we're going to look at how a bill becomes a law. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this. Your textbook goes into a lot of depth, so please make sure you do read that. But I'm going to give you kind of the overview of what's called the regular order. Here I also have a link to the How Bill Becomes a Law. That's the old Schoolhouse Rock. And then I also have on side 6 here another chart. This is much like figure 10.3 in your textbook. A chart here showing the flow of how a bill becomes a law. So Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution assigns the legislative power, meaning the power to make law, to the Congress of the United States. The framers viewed the legislative power as the fundamental power of the government and believed it should belong to a representative assembly and not the executive or the courts. So they wanted the power to make the laws to ultimately hold in the hands of the people. How do the members become members of Congress? They get voted in by the people. Any member of the House or Senate may propose a law, and these are usually called bills. It must be passed by a majority vote in both the House and Congress and signed by the President to become a law. We also have what we call resolutions. These essentially are expressions of congressional opinion and do not have the force of law. There is one exception with the resolution, and that's called a joint resolution. And these are used for emergency appropriations, to propose constitutional amendments, or to declare war. So what we're going to look at is what's called the regular order. This is your basic textbook version of how a bill becomes a law. Again, slide 6 here and figure 10.3 in your textbook outlines this. So roughly what happens, a member introduces legislation and the Rules Committee refers the bill to the appropriate subject matter committee. In the committee, the bill is debated and hearings are held before a final draft of the proposed legislation is reported out and then voted on by the full chamber. If it passes, then it goes to the other chamber of Congress and the steps are repeated. Once it passes both, it goes to the conference committee. They make a report, then both chambers have to approve any amendments, and then once that is adopted by both, it goes to the White House. And again, that's a general summary of this regular order. Again, please see the text for more specific details. Here's a few important terms, though. What's called the filibuster. This is a tool used by members of the Senate to prevent action on legislation they oppose by continuously holding the floor and speaking until the majority backs down. Once given the floor, senators have unlimited time to speak. And it actually requires, if they want to stop a filibuster, it requires a 3/5 vote of the Senate, that's 60 votes, to end a filibuster. And that's called cloture. The longest filibuster ever given was actually by the Democratic Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina in 1957. He spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes. And unfortunately, he was trying to filibuster the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Luckily for us, he failed to do so. All right, then we also have the veto. The veto is very important. What is the veto when we're talking about bills becoming laws? A veto is the presidential's constitutional power to turn down acts of Congress. The president will, if they veto it, they will release a veto statement citing the reasons for vetoing the bill, and then the bill returns to the chamber from which it originated. Now, this veto can be overridden, but it takes a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress to override a veto, and this is rare. So an example of the 45 presidents we've had, because remember, 2 have been elected to non-consecutive terms, 38 of the 45 presidents have used the power of veto 2,576 times. Vetoes have only been overridden 111 times. And then we also had called the pocket veto. And what this is this is if the president does not act on a given legislation passed during the final 10 days of a legislative session. So basically what happens is both sides agree on it, they send it to the president, and it's called a pocket veto because it's like if the president puts it in their pocket. If Congress adjourns while the bill is in the president's pocket, the bill dies and does not become a law. However, if it's in the president's pocket and Congress remains in session, the bill automatically becomes law after 10 days. And then that's going to bring us to the section called unorthodox lawmaking. So regular order ensures a deliberative process in which many voices are heard and both the majority and minority parties play a role. However, unorthodox lawmaking reflects the strengthening of partisanship and the power of party leaders. It does not emphasize deliberation over bills. It usually is a faster process, but is it better? And I want you to think about, is it dangerous? We have what's called follow the leader lawmaking. This is where party leaders push the president's agenda or is to do battle with the president if the president is of the opposing party. Also, we have what's called closed rules, or these are often called gag rules, and these prohibit most floor amendments and often limit debate to very short periods of times. We also have what's called a practice called multiple referral. So what happens here are bills are sent to several committees rather than just one for consideration and markup. What this does, it prevents any one committee from blocking a piece of legislation. It was first used in 1975 with a House rule change. And this is also more likely to be used in the House than in the Senate. We also have what's called ping-ponging. And what happens in this is where we send amendments back and forth between the relevant House and Senate committees to reconcile differences between bills or major measures without convening a conference committee at all. Conference committees can expand the number of voices heard in the debate and give minorities more weapons to block an enactment bill. So ping-ponging takes that away. It takes away the conference committees. And then we have what's called the omnibus. Now we have to remember that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the primary role in the government's budgetary process, right? This is called the power of the purse. And we have what's called appropriation. So appropriation is the amount of money approved by Congress in bills that each unit or agency of the government can spend. And you have to think about this. You need the money. So maybe you have a program that gets approved, but without funding, there basically is no program. So what we see is happening is we'll have an omnibus appropriation bill. And what will happen is they will combine all or many of the smaller appropriation bills into one single package that can be passed with one vote in each house of Congress. Basically, if you miss the omnibus, you don't get your funding, your bill's not going to happen. For the most part with this process, the minority is excluded in this. So basically, the omnibus bill is the budgetary component of unorthodox lawmaking. Usually, this omnibus bill is massive in size. I think the example from the textbook is like 2,000 pages, and often they have very little time to read it, let alone to debate it. So those are some unorthodox practices in lawmaking. So who influences congressional decision making? We have external influences, and these are the legislator's constituency and various interest groups, and then internal influences, which include the party leadership, congressional colleagues, and the president. Now, we've already talked about the constituency some. Again, the Congress members often want to be reelected, so the views of their constituents are of primary influence on the decisions they make. What's interesting, though, is most constituents, most voters, actually pay little attention to politics and often do not even know what policies their representatives support. Think about it right now. Think about who is your senator, who is your House of Representative. If you even know who they are, right? Think about, do you know what their policies are, what they're doing? And most Americans, sadly, don't know this. All right, interest groups, we've already talked about this in a previous lecture. Their influences interest groups have, including mobilizing constituents, getting them to go out and vote. They serve as watchdogs on congressional action, and they supply candidates with information and money. Often they use what's called a legislative scorecard that rates how members of Congress vote on issues of importance to that group, and then they post these for the public to see. And this may provide a potent weapon in the next elections. Interest groups' main effect is to encourage members already inclined to agree with them to work harder on behalf of the group's interests. So somebody who's already in Congress, if it supports a specific interest group, what the interest group wants is they want then that member to influence other congressional members. And then we have the party. Again, we have already largely discussed this in previous chapters. Party leaders have a good deal of influence over the behavior of their party members. And we have what's called a party unity vote. This is a roll call vote in the House or the Senate in which at least 50% of the members of one party take a particular position and are opposed by at least 50% of the members of the other party. We see this very, very high today and very often today. We have high level of party discipline. It continues. Party division continues. Party unity also arises when congressional leaders try to put partisan stamp on legislature, when they try to kind of distract by saying, instead of just look at it, right, that this is, it's by the party lines. And we're actually, as I'm recording this, we're literally seeing this happening right now. Right now, President Trump is trying to get his big, beautiful bill being passed, and he is making it a very, very party issue. Why? Because he has majorities of his party. And so by trying to make it a pure party issue, he's basically saying, well, if you don't vote for it, then you're being a traitor to your party. Also, as we've already talked about, is polarization, and we very clearly see this in Congress. Many critics charge that Congress is too slow and cumbersome to deal with crisis. However, Congress can act very quickly, and we saw this an example in March 2020 when they enacted major funding programs in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We see much of this non-action as a result of polarization, again, meaning that they're so divided on these issues that we can't come together, right, and make compromises. And then also, Congress does more than make laws. They have the power to approve treaties and appointments. They have the power of oversight. This is the effort by Congress through hearings, investigations, and other techniques to exercise control over the activities of executive agencies. This is carried out by committees and subcommittees, and the purpose is to locate inefficiencies or abuse of power, to explore the relationship between what an agency does and what a law intends, or to change or to abolish a program. They can subpoena witnesses, administer oaths, cross-examine, compel testimony, and bring criminal charges for contempt and perjury. Also, the Senate itself has the power to advise and consent. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution says President can do certain things, but only with the advice and consent of the Senate. So 2 examples of that is approving treaties. The president can make treaties, however, it has to be approved by 2/3 of the present senators. Also, for appointments, the president has the power to appoint, however, the Senate must approve. And this is by a simple majority, that's 50% plus 1. And then probably Congress's largest power, besides making law, is impeachment. Impeachment power is the power of Congress to remove the president or other officials and is a safeguard against the executive tyranny so greatly feared by the framers of the Constitution. And this power is granted by the Constitution. So what happens? A formal charge is brought by the House of Representatives that a government official has committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Officials who are found guilty are removed from office. If the House votes to impeach, the Senate then acts like a trial jury, voting on whether to convict and remove the official. And again, that requires 2/3 of a majority of the Senate. The House has initiated impeachment powers more than 60 times in U.S. history. However, fewer than 20 officials were ultimately impeached. Only 8, and they were all federal judges, were convicted by the Senate and removed from office. Many of them resign before this happens. Only 3 presidents have actually been impeached, and those are Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. In fact, Donald Trump was impeached twice. Now, technically, right, we've got the picture of Richard Nixon here. Technically, Richard Nixon was not impeached. Why? Because he resigned before the proceedings could come about. Why? Because it was very clear not only would he have been impeached, but he would have been found guilty and convicted and would have been removed from office. And so what he did is he resigned before that actually could come about. All right, so that's going to conclude our lecture looking specifically at Congress.